You have exactly 2 hours before we remove you from this property, Mr. Bennett. That was the first thing the HOA president said to me while standing on my dock at 6:30 in the morning with sheriff deputies behind her and a bulldozer idling near my barn. My name is Cole Bennett. I'm 42 years old. I live in western Montana, and I run a lakeside cattle ranch that's been in my family since my grandfather bought the land after the Korean War. I've spent most of my life fixing fences, hauling feed, and trying to stay as far away from HOA politics as possible. Apparently, that morning, the HOA decided my ranch was their problem. The air smelled like wet pine and diesel fuel as gravel crunched under expensive SUVs pulling onto my property one after another. Neighbors stood near the road with coffee cups in their hands like they were about to watch a live show. Some of them were already filming with their phones. Victoria Hale stepped forward wearing a perfectly pressed white jacket like she was arriving at a country club brunch instead of somebody else's land. She handed me a stack of papers and smiled. Due to repeated violations and disputed shoreline boundaries.
Look closely at the property lines. You'll see I own this entire ranch.
No, that's impossible.
This property is now under temporary HOA seizure pending county review. The sound of metal chains rattling against the trailer hit me harder than I expected. Victoria must have noticed because her smile widened. You should have complied months ago, Cole. The crazy part? I'd never even joined their HOA. My ranch existed decades before their luxury lake development showed up around me. But over the last year, Victoria kept sending violation notices anyway. First because my fishing boat was visually disruptive. Then because my cattle fencing reduced neighborhood aesthetics. Then she demanded access to my shoreline for HOA kayaking events. Every time I ignored her letters, she escalated. But this? Bringing sheriff deputies onto my land before sunrise? Even I didn't think she'd go this far. One deputy walked toward my barn carrying a chain lock, while another started photographing my equipment. Victoria pointed toward the water and said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. By noon today, this entire shoreline will belong to the HOA. Some neighbors actually clapped. I wish I was kidding. Around the 4-minute mark, drop a comment. Tell me where you're from. And if something like this has ever happened to you, I want to hear it. I stared across the lake while cold wind pushed small waves against the dock posts. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. One of the HOA workers had spray-painted orange marks directly beside the old cedar storage shed my grandfather told me never to tear down. Suddenly, I didn't care about the notices anymore. Because hidden inside that shed was something Victoria Hale absolutely did not know existed. And if I was right, the people trying to seize my ranch were about to discover they had built their entire HOA on the wrong land. Victoria Hale acted like she had already won before the county had even reviewed a single document. Less than an hour after those deputies showed up at my ranch, the HOA started turning the entire neighborhood against me. By lunchtime, photos of my barn and boat dock were already posted inside the community Facebook group with captions calling me a trespasser and a dangerous obstruction to lake development. One woman wrote that I had been illegally using HOA shoreline access for years, which made absolutely no sense considering my family owned that shoreline decades before any of those homes existed. But once Victoria started talking, people believed whatever came out of her mouth. I stood near my fence line watching contractors unload fresh cedar posts while the sound of nail guns echoed across the water. Every few minutes another golf cart rolled past my driveway slowly, like people were touring a crime scene. Some stared. Some recorded videos. Others smiled like they were finally watching the stubborn rancher get humbled. Victoria loved every second of it. Around noon, she organized an emergency HOA community walk that just happened to pass directly through the edge of my ranch property. I watched nearly 30 residents follow her down the gravel road, carrying bottled water and folding chairs while she pointed toward my equipment shed like she was giving a museum tour. This area has been in violation for years, she announced loudly. Once the HOA secures the land, property values will finally recover. Recover? That word almost made me laugh. Most of those expensive lake houses existed because my grandfather sold off small pieces of unused timber acreage 40 years ago. Without Bennett Ranch, none of them would even be there. But Victoria had rewritten the story so many times that people started treating me like I was the outsider. One man standing near the road yelled, "You should have followed the rules, buddy." Another woman asked one of the deputies if they were going to remove my fishing boats next. Crazy part was watching the sheriff deputies slowly start acting like HOA employees instead of county officers. One of them walked over to me and suggested it would be easier if I cooperated peacefully before things escalated further. Escalated. On my own land. I looked past him toward the old cedar shed again. The faded green paint was peeling worse than I remembered, and one corner of the roof sagged slightly under years of Montana snow. My grandfather built that shed himself in 1961. He used to tell me, never let anybody touch what is inside there. I thought he meant his old fishing gear or military keepsakes. But now, I was starting to think he meant something much bigger. Victoria eventually marched straight up to me holding another stack of papers and a fake sympathetic smile. Cole, this would all go much smoother if you just accepted reality. Then she leaned closer and lowered her voice. By tomorrow morning, your dock, your shoreline, and probably half this ranch will legally belong to the HOA. The wind pushed cold lake water against the dock posts behind us with a hollow knocking sound. I stared at her for a second, then glanced toward the clubhouse sitting across the shoreline less than half a mile away. Big stone entrance, fresh paint, brand new marina slips, expensive landscaping. And suddenly, for the first time all day, I noticed something that made my pulse slow down instead of speed up. The HOA clubhouse fence line looked almost perfectly aligned with the markings on the old survey map I had seen hidden inside the shed. That was the exact moment I realized Victoria Hale was not just trying to seize the wrong ranch. She might have built her entire empire on the wrong property. That night, after the HOA crowd finally cleared out and the lake went quiet again, I walked back to the cedar shed with a flashlight in one hand and the old survey tube under my arm. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s, and cold wind rolled off the water hard enough to make the metal roof creak above me. I had not stepped inside that shed in years. The smell of old cedar, machine oil, and lake water hit me the second I opened the door. Dust floated through the flashlight beam while rain tapped softly against the windows. My grandfather used to spend hours in there alone, organizing maps and paperwork nobody else was allowed to touch. Back then, I thought he was just stubborn. Now I was starting to realize he may have been protecting something. I cleared off an old workbench and spread the faded survey map flat across the wood. The paper crackled at the edges like it could fall apart any second. Most of it showed the original Bennett Ranch boundaries from 1958, long before the luxury homes, before the marina, before the HOA clubhouse with its fancy stone fireplace and wine tastings. At first glance, the lines looked confusing. But the longer I stared at them, the worse my stomach started tightening. According to the original property markers, the current HOA shoreline did not match the legal shoreline at all. Not even close. I grabbed another flashlight and walked outside toward the fence line overlooking the water. Across the lake, lights from the clubhouse reflected off the surface in long golden streaks. Expensive boats bobbed quietly beside the marina slips, while music drifted faintly from the outdoor patio. Victoria Hale was probably over there celebrating already. She really believed she had beaten me. I looked back down at the old survey markings again. Then I noticed something that made my heart start pounding. One of the original boundary symbols on the map matched a stone marker sitting half-buried near my shoreline trail. I had walked past that rock my entire life without thinking twice about it. The next morning, before sunrise, I drove straight into town with the survey tube riding in the passenger seat beside me. Fog hung low over the highway while county snowplows pushed dirty slush off the shoulders from a storm earlier that week. I pulled into the county records office right when they opened. The woman behind the counter recognized my last name immediately. Bennett Ranch? She asked. I thought the HOA was taking part of your shoreline today. I slid the map across the counter carefully. I need the original land records tied to this survey. She adjusted her glasses and studied the document for nearly 30 seconds before her expression changed completely. Where exactly did you find this? She asked quietly. I told her it belonged to my grandfather. She disappeared into the back room for almost 20 minutes while I sat there listening to old fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Finally, she returned carrying 2 thick property archive books and a folded county plat map. The second she opened it across the counter, I felt the blood drain from my face. The modern HOA property lines were sitting almost 400 feet west of where they legally should have been, which meant the clubhouse, half the marina, and several lakefront walking paths were not built on HOA land at all. They were built on mine. The woman lowered her voice immediately. Mr. Bennett, if this survey is legitimate, your homeowners association may have a very serious problem. Then she pointed toward one specific line on the county map. And that was the exact moment I realized Victoria Hale had made one mistake so massive it could destroy the entire HOA. The county records clerk printed copies of the original land surveys for me that afternoon, but before handing them over, she closed the office window blinds first. That alone told me how serious this had become. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper while she pointed at overlapping property lines on the county plat map spread across the counter. Mr. Bennett, according to these records, the current homeowners association development does not fully sit inside the approved land transfer boundaries from 1987. Most likely, somebody relied on updated shoreline estimates instead of the original survey markers. Then she tapped the edge of the map with her pen. But this section here, the clubhouse parcel should never have been approved under the homeowners association. My pulse started pounding hard enough that I could hear it in my ears. The clubhouse was the center of everything Victoria Hale controlled. Every meeting, every fine, every vote, every rule enforcement started there. And if the original survey was accurate, then the most important building in the entire neighborhood was sitting on Bennett Ranch property. I drove back home slowly with the paperwork locked inside a weatherproof folder beside me. Snow clouds were rolling over the mountains, and the lake looked dark gray under the late afternoon sky. But the second I turned onto my gravel road, I knew Victoria had escalated things again. Fresh orange construction fencing now stretched across part of my shoreline trail. Someone had hammered new HOA signs directly into fence posts near my dock that read private community access only. One sign had even been planted beside my grandfather's old fishing bench. That one made my jaw tighten. A black luxury SUV sat parked near the barn, while two contractors measured along the water with laser tools. Victoria stood beside them wearing knee-high boots and holding a clipboard like she was supervising a resort expansion. The second she saw my truck, her expression changed into that same confident smile she always used when she thought she had complete control. "Perfect timing," she said while walking toward me. "The board voted this afternoon to begin immediate shoreline integration." Out of the truck slowly. "Shoreline integration?" She nodded proudly. "The community deserves full lake access. Once your remaining appeals fail, this entire section becomes HOA recreational property." One of the contractors behind her started spray painting new marker lines dangerously close to the cedar shed. I looked at the paint drifting through the cold air, then back at Victoria. "You might want to stop them before they make an expensive mistake." She laughed out loud. Actually laughed. "Cole, you lost. Everybody knows it." Then she lowered her sunglasses slightly and pointed toward the clubhouse across the lake. Warm lights glowed from inside while residents gathered for another HOA meeting. "See that building? That is what successful property management looks like." I followed her finger toward the clubhouse and marina sitting peacefully against the shoreline. Expensive boats, stone pathways, brand new cedar decks, tens of millions of dollars in development, all sitting exactly where the original county map said they should not be. Victoria crossed her arms. "By tomorrow morning, county crews will begin placing permanent access barriers around your dock." I stared at her for a long second before speaking. "You really should have checked the original land surveys before starting this." And the moment she found out, everything she built her power on was going to start falling apart. The next morning started with the sound of engines outside my ranch gate before the sun even came up. I stepped onto my porch holding a cup of black coffee and saw 3 county trucks parked beside the road along with another pair of HOA security vehicles. White floodlights cut through the early morning fog rolling off the lake, while workers unloaded stacks of steel fencing from a trailer. Victoria Hale stood near the gate in a long tan coat, talking confidently with one of the sheriff deputies like she was running the entire county herself. The second she noticed me walking down the porch steps, she smiled like someone about to enjoy the best moment of her life. "The board approved emergency recreational access expansion late last night. By authority of the Homeowners Association and pending county enforcement review, this area will now be secured for community development." She sounded proud of every word. One contractor started unloading fence panels directly beside my dock, while another hammered temporary stakes into the ground near the cedar shed. The metallic pounding echoed across the water sharp enough to make my jaw tighten. I had spent almost the entire night reviewing those county maps with an attorney friend from Missoula named Daniel Harper. Daniel specialized in land disputes and nearly spilled his coffee when he saw the original surveys. His exact words were, "Cole, if these records are legitimate, the Homeowners Association is standing on a legal landmine." But he also warned me not to reveal everything too early. "Let them keep escalating," he said. "The deeper they go, the worse this becomes for them later." So that morning, I stayed calm, even while Victoria acted like she already owned my ranch. Around 7:30, more residents gathered along the road watching workers prepare to block access to my shoreline trail. Some filmed videos. Others whispered while staring at me like I was some stubborn old man refusing eviction. One teenage kid actually asked his father if I was getting arrested. Victoria made sure everybody heard her response. "Only if he interferes with lawful property enforcement." Then she looked directly at me. Last chance to cooperate peacefully. I glanced across the lake toward the clubhouse sitting under soft morning fog. Expensive cedar decks. Fresh landscaping. Luxury marina slips. Everything looked polished and perfect, which made it even harder to believe the entire structure might legally belong on my property records. One of the county workers approached Victoria holding a clipboard. "Ma'am, before permanent barriers go in, we still need final confirmation on the western shoreline markers." "What older survey?" she asked sharply. The worker shrugged. "County records flagged a discrepancy this morning." Victoria slowly turned toward me. Cold wind moved across the lake while dock chains rattled softly against wooden posts behind us. I could actually see the calculation happening in her head for the first time since this started. She realized something had changed overnight. I took a sip of coffee and said calmly, "You should probably stop construction until the county finishes reviewing the original property lines." Her eyes narrowed immediately. "What did you do?" Before I could answer, one of the sheriff deputies suddenly received a radio call. He listened for several seconds, then looked over toward Victoria with an expression I had not seen from anyone all week. Uncertainty. And whatever message came through that radio was serious enough to make the deputy quietly say, "Ma'am, I think we may need to pause this operation." The entire shoreline operation stopped within minutes after that radio call came through. Contractors who had been unloading steel fencing suddenly stood around awkwardly beside their trucks waiting for instructions, while sheriff deputies gathered near the road speaking quietly into radios. Victoria Hale looked furious. Not nervous yet, just irritated that somebody had interrupted what she thought was already a finished victory. "What is going on?" she snapped at the deputy who had paused the operation. He glanced toward me before answering carefully. "County records requested a temporary hold pending verification of an older land survey." Victoria laughed once in disbelief. "An old survey does not override active development boundaries." The deputy shifted uncomfortably. Apparently this one might. That was the first moment the people standing around started realizing something bigger was happening. Neighbors who had spent the entire morning whispering about my eviction suddenly stopped talking altogether. Even the contractors looked uneasy now. Victoria turned toward me sharply. "You went to the county office." I kept my voice calm. "I checked my property records." "You manipulated this," she said immediately. "This is another one of your delay tactics." But her confidence sounded thinner than before. She pulled out her phone and stormed several feet away while making a furious call to somebody from the HOA legal department. I could hear fragments drifting across the cold wind coming off the lake. "No, that is impossible, because we already cleared this years ago." "Then why is the county involved?" The same residents who had been laughing earlier now looked confused. One older man near the road quietly asked another neighbor, "Wait, does Bennett actually own that land?" Nobody answered him. 30 minutes later, a Silver County survey truck rolled onto my property. Two surveyors stepped out carrying tripods, measuring poles, and old county marker records. The second Victoria saw them, she marched straight over. "This is private HOA development property," she announced loudly. One of the surveyors looked at her calmly. "That is exactly what we are here to verify." The silence after that sentence felt heavy enough to stop the wind itself. The survey team began walking the shoreline slowly, checking old stone markers buried near the waterline and comparing coordinates against archived county plats. Every few minutes one of them would stop, whisper something to the other, then check the maps again. None of that looked good for Victoria. By early afternoon, the entire neighborhood had turned into a rumor factory. Residents gathered outside the clubhouse whispering about possible land disputes, while social media exploded with speculation. Some people blamed the county. Others blamed the original developers. But one rumor spread faster than all the others combined. The clubhouse itself might not legally belong to the homeowners association. That rumor hit Victoria harder than anything else so far. She drove straight from my ranch to the clubhouse parking lot, where an emergency HOA board meeting started less than an hour later. Through the marina security gate, I watched luxury SUVs pouring into the lot while angry residents demanded answers outside. One woman shouted that her property value could collapse if the development boundaries were wrong. Another man yelled that the HOA had already collected millions in dues tied to lake access rights. Meanwhile, Daniel Harper called me from Missoula. His voice sounded far more serious than before. "Cole, listen carefully. I reviewed every county transfer document from the original development filing." And there was a long pause before he answered. "The homeowners association may have a catastrophic title problem." I stared across the water toward the glowing clubhouse windows where Victoria Hale was desperately trying to keep control of a situation she no longer understood. Then Daniel said one sentence that made everything suddenly feel much bigger than a neighborhood dispute. "Cole, if this goes where I think it is going, you might legally own the most valuable part of that entire lake community." By the next afternoon, the entire lake community felt different. People who used to wave confidently from golf carts were suddenly standing in small groups, whispering near mailboxes and marina paths. Every conversation stopped the second I drove past. Rumors had spread fast after the county paused the shoreline seizure, but what nobody knew yet was just how bad the situation actually was for the homeowners association. Daniel Harper arrived at my ranch around 3 o'clock, carrying 2 thick legal binders and a portable scanner in the back of his truck. Sky hung low and gray over the lake, while cold wind rattled tree branches along the shoreline. We spread every document across my kitchen table while coffee steamed beside stacks of county plats, property transfers, and archived surveys. Daniel adjusted his glasses and pointed at a sequence of development filings from the late 1980s. "Here is where everything went wrong," he said. According to the original county approval, the developer who built the HOA had only purchased partial shoreline access rights from neighboring properties. But somewhere during later expansions, updated surveys shifted the official western property line several hundred feet beyond the original boundary markers. Nobody caught it. Or worse, nobody wanted to catch it. The more Daniel traced through the records, the uglier it became. The clubhouse parcel itself was tied to a revised shoreline estimate that conflicted directly with the original Bennett Ranch survey filed decades earlier. "This should have triggered a title review immediately," Daniel muttered. But somehow it kept getting approved. I leaned back in my chair staring toward the lake through the kitchen windows. Across the water, lights already glowed inside the clubhouse while residents gathered for another emergency HOA meeting. They still had no idea the building they were sitting inside might legally belong on my land. Then Daniel said something that made the entire situation feel unreal. "Cole, if this reaches litigation, the homeowners association could face massive liability exposure." "How massive?" I asked quietly. He looked at me carefully before answering. "Potentially enough to bankrupt the association." At almost that exact moment, my phone started vibrating nonstop on the table. Missed calls, unknown numbers, text messages from neighbors who had ignored me for years suddenly asking if the rumors were true. One message simply read, "Black luxury SUV pulled up near the porch, and for the first time since this entire mess started, Victoria Hale stepped out without her usual confident smile." She was still dressed perfectly, but now there was tension in every movement. She walked toward the house, carrying a leather folder pressed tightly against her chest, while icy wind blew strands of hair across her face. Daniel glanced out the window. "That is not somebody arriving to celebrate," he said quietly. I opened the front door before she even knocked. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The only sound came from lake water hitting the dock posts below the hill. Victoria finally cleared her throat. "We need to discuss this privately." Her tone had changed completely. No audience. No speeches. No fake authority. Just controlled panic. Daniel stayed seated at the kitchen table behind me while stacks of legal documents remained spread across the wood. Victoria noticed them immediately. Her eyes locked onto the old county survey sitting on top of the pile, and I watched the color slowly drain from her face. She already knew. Maybe not everything yet, but enough. Cole, she said carefully, there may have been administrative errors during prior development phases. Administrative errors. That was how she described trying to seize my ranch while standing on land that might legally belong to me. I folded my arms. You brought sheriff deputies onto my property. She swallowed hard. We can still resolve this quietly. That sentence told me more than anything else could have. Because people only ask for quiet resolutions when they finally realize how loud the truth is about to become. Victoria Hale stood in my kitchen looking nothing like the woman who had marched sheriff deputies onto my ranch 2 days earlier. The confidence was gone. The sharp HOA president voice was gone too. Now she sounded careful, measured, almost afraid to say the wrong thing. Daniel Harper stayed seated at the table flipping slowly through county plats while Victoria kept glancing nervously at the stacks of legal documents spread across the wood. Outside, evening fog drifted across the lake and blurred the lights from the marina into long pale streaks over the water. Finally, Victoria took a slow breath and placed her leather folder on the counter. The board is willing to discuss a private settlement, she said quietly. I leaned against the sink with my arms folded. A settlement for what exactly? She hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. 2 days earlier, she acted like I was some stubborn rancher refusing to obey HOA rules. Now she could not even say the words property dispute out loud. Daniel looked up from the paperwork calmly. Mrs. Hale, are you acknowledging that the Homeowners Association may have constructed improvements outside its legal parcel boundaries? Victoria immediately stiffened again. I did not say that. Daniel nodded once. Interesting. Silence filled the kitchen for several seconds except for the sound of lake wind brushing against the porch screens outside. Then Victoria lowered her voice even more. Look, nobody wants this situation escalating publicly. I almost laughed hearing that from the same woman who publicly called me a trespasser in front of half the neighborhood. You already escalated it publicly, I said. You brought county crews to my property. She pressed her lips together tightly. The board acted based on the surveys we had available. Daniel slid one of the original county plats across the table toward her. And now you have different surveys. Victoria stared down at the map. I watched the exact moment she recognized the original shoreline markers tied to Bennett Ranch. Her face lost color instantly. This cannot be right, she whispered. Daniel answered calmly. Unfortunately for your board, county archive records suggest it is. Victoria sat down slowly like her knees suddenly felt weak. Outside, headlights moved along the lakeside road while residents continued gathering around the clubhouse for another emergency HOA meeting. Nobody inside that building understood how close the entire community might be to financial disaster. Victoria finally looked back at me. What exactly do you want, Cole? That question stayed hanging in the room for several seconds. Honestly, at that point, I was not even sure anymore. Days earlier, I just wanted the HOA to leave my ranch alone. But after discovering what they had done with those property lines, the situation had become something much bigger. Daniel closed one of the binders carefully. Right now, my client wants the harassment to stop immediately. Victoria nodded quickly. Done. He also wants all seizure actions permanently withdrawn. Fine. Daniel leaned back in his chair. And there is still the issue of the clubhouse, marina, walking trails, and common shoreline structures potentially occupying Bennett Ranch land. That sentence hit like a truck. Victoria looked physically sick hearing it spoken out loud. She rubbed her forehead slowly. Do you understand what happens if this becomes public? Daniel answered before I could. Oh, we understand perfectly. Her eyes darted toward me again. Residents could lose access rights. Property values could collapse. There could be lawsuits. There already will be lawsuits, Daniel said quietly. The room went silent again. Then something happened I never expected to see from Victoria Hale. She looked directly at me and said, almost under her breath. Then my phone buzzed with a new message from the county survey office. Daniel read it over my shoulder and went completely silent. I turned slowly back toward Victoria. You have got an even bigger problem than you think. Daniel held the county message out toward me while Victoria Hale stared across the kitchen table, trying to keep her composure together. The message came directly from the County Land Review Office, and it changed everything. The original shoreline survey from 1958 had just been verified against archived federal mapping records. partially verified, fully verified, which meant the legal boundary markers tied to Bennett Ranch were officially recognized as accurate. And according to those verified records, the Homeowners Association clubhouse, marina access paths, boat slips, and nearly 12 acres of lakefront common property had been built outside the legal HOA parcel boundaries. Silence filled the kitchen so completely I could hear the refrigerator humming behind us. Victoria slowly lowered herself into a chair and whispered, "No." Daniel looked at her calmly. "Yes." Outside, snow began falling lightly over the lake while soft yellow lights glowed from the clubhouse across the water. Residents were still gathered there for another emergency board meeting, completely unaware that the building underneath them was now tied to a confirmed county ownership dispute. Victoria rubbed both hands against her face before finally speaking again. "If this becomes public tomorrow morning, the Homeowners Association is finished." I stared at her for several seconds. Part of me remembered every fine notice she mailed to my ranch, every threat, every arrogant speech in front of neighbors, every attempt to turn the entire community against me. She treated me like some outdated obstacle standing in the way of luxury development. And now the same ranch she tried to seize was the only thing holding her entire community together legally. Daniel closed the final binder and slid it toward me. "At this point, you have several options. We are prepared to negotiate compensation." Compensation. A week earlier, she tried taking my shoreline with sheriff deputies. Now she was offering money just to avoid public exposure. I walked toward the kitchen window and looked out across the frozen shoreline. Snowflakes drifted slowly through the dock lights while the lake moved dark and quiet beneath the storm clouds. Then I thought about my grandfather warning me for years never to ignore old land records. He knew something was wrong long before any of us did. He just never lived long enough to prove it. Finally, I turned back toward Victoria. "I am not destroying the community," I said calmly. Relief flashed across her face instantly. "Too early. But the HOA is going to correct every single thing it did to my family." Her expression tightened again. Daniel nodded slightly beside me. I continued. "Every false violation gets removed. Every seizure notice disappears. Every restriction against my ranch is terminated permanently." Victoria swallowed hard. "Done. And from now on," I said, "the HOA signs a legal land use agreement with Bennett Ranch for every structure sitting on my property." The silence after that sentence felt enormous, because she understood exactly what it meant. The Homeowners Association that tried controlling my ranch would now need permission from me to keep operating the center of their entire community. Victoria stared down at the table for several seconds before quietly asking, "What happens if the board refuses?" Daniel answered for me. "Then the county dispute proceeds publicly." Nobody spoke after that. The wind outside rattled the porch screen softly while snow continued falling across the lake. For the first time since this nightmare started, Victoria Hale looked small. Not powerful, not intimidating, just somebody who finally realized arrogance had led her straight into disaster. 2 weeks later, the Homeowners Association board voted to remove Victoria as president during an emergency meeting packed with furious residents. The seizure notices against my ranch vanished completely. HOA crews removed every fence marker they placed near my shoreline. And by spring, a brand new legal agreement had been signed recognizing Bennett Ranch ownership rights over the disputed land parcels around the clubhouse and marina. The same community that once treated me like a problem now waved every time I drove past. Funny how quickly people change when the truth finally surfaces. In the end, the Homeowners Association failed because power made them careless. They stopped respecting boundaries, stopped verifying facts, and believed intimidation was stronger than the law. I won because I stayed calm, trusted the records, and understood something they ignored from the beginning. Real ownership does not come from loud authority. It comes from proof. And the biggest lesson in all of this? Never underestimate quiet people protecting something their family built long before anybody else arrived.